"You never told me you are this tight," Cowboy said to his mail-order bride as he gasps. The train reached Willow Creek just as the sun dipped behind the far Wyoming hills, spilling long shadows across the plains. Winter was edging in early that year, the kind that carried a sharp bite with every gust. Folks said it meant hard times ahead. Folks always said something. But today the entire town had gathered for something more exciting than weather talk. A mail-order bride was arriving. News traveled fast in a town with only one saloon, one church, and neighbors close enough to hear your heartbeat. Colt Maddox stood a little apart from the crowd, hands tucked into the worn pockets of his coat, hat pulled low against the glare. He was not a man who enjoyed being stared at, yet today he could feel every set of eyes watching him. Maybe because he wasn't the sort who'd seem to need a bride. Maybe because people still whispered about the fire, about what he'd lost and never spoken of again. But he had written those letters. Every month. Slowly. Carefully. Almost reluctantly. And she had written back. He didn't know why that mattered so much. Only that it had kept him company in a world that had grown too quiet. The train slowed with a metallic groan, steam hissing like a dragon waking from sleep. Colt's heart kicked once, hard, though his face didn't reveal a thing. People leaned forward, curious as children. Passengers spilled out. A traveling salesman, a mother with 3 children, 2 miners returning from the mountains. Then, just as the last of them stepped away, someone else appeared at the doorway. A young woman, small in stature but carrying herself with unexpected steadiness. Her dress was the deep blue of late evening, wrinkled from travel but carefully kept. A carpet bag hung from one hand. Snowflakes clung to the curls escaping her bonnet. She paused at the top of the steps, breath frosting in the cold, eyes scanning the platform. Colt knew instantly, it was her. Hannah Rose Whitfield. The woman he had written to with stiff, awkward sentences, who had answered with surprising warmth. The woman who had stepped into his life through words, long before she stepped off this train. She spotted him. She walked toward him, boots crunching across the frosted boards. She didn't hurry. She didn't shrink. Instead, she held her head just high enough to show she had made her choice and meant to stand by it. "Mr. Maddox?" she asked gently when she reached him. Her voice took him by surprise, not because it was soft, but because it carried resolve beneath the softness. A quiet iron, the kind that doesn't shout for strength but simply has it. Colt nodded once. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Colt." A nervous smile touched her lips. "I am very glad to finally meet you." Colt opened his mouth to answer, but words didn't form fast enough. For someone who could silence a saloon with a glare, he suddenly found himself at a loss. She shifted her carpet bag. "I hope you haven't been waiting long. I feared the storm back east would delay our arrival." "I been waitin' months," he heard himself say. "A few minutes on a platform don't count." Her eyes softened as if she understood more than his words revealed. He looked at the single small bag in her hand. That was all she owned in the world, all she'd brought across states to join a man who barely smiled and lived miles from civilization. "That everything?" he asked. She nodded. "I traveled light. I lost most things a long while back." Colt didn't ask what lost meant. He didn't need to, not yet. Her gaze held enough stories to fill a book. "Your letters made it sound like you'd be..." He stopped before finishing the sentence, realizing too late that any guess would be wrong. She lifted a brow politely. "Like I'd be what, Mr. Maddox?" "Fragile, I reckon." A small spark lit her eyes, amusement mixed with something older, deeper. Hurt that had healed into something strong. "Well," she murmured, "I suppose travel teaches you what you're made of." She turned toward his waiting wagon without waiting for him to lead, boots crunching over patches of snow, her posture steady as the mountains beyond the town. Colt blinked, stared for a moment, then followed her. When he offered his hand to help her climb into the wagon, she accepted it without hesitation. Her fingers were cold through the glove, but her grip was firm. As he settled beside her and urged the horses into motion, she looked out over the vast, untamed land. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Colt glanced at her, a quiet woman with a brave heart, sitting beside him on a wagon bound for a burned-down ranch and a life that wasn't easy. And for the first time in a long while, the land did look beautiful. He cleared his throat softly. "I'm glad you're here, Hannah." She didn't turn to him. But her lip curved just slightly into a smile. "And I'm glad I came," she said. As the wagon rolled out of Willow Creek, townsfolk watched them disappear into the open prairie, 2 strangers tied by letters, hope, and a promise neither yet understood, but both were willing to see through. The sun had slipped behind the far-reaching hills by the time Colt Maddox guided the wagon onto the open prairie. Evening stretched wide and quiet around them, the sky turning a deep wash of violet and fading gold. The faint howl of distant wolves threaded through the wind like a warning. Hannah Rose Whitfield sat beside him, hands folded neatly atop her carpetbag, posture straight despite the rattling wagon wheels. She didn't cling to the seat. She didn't flinch at the unfamiliar wilderness. Instead, she looked around with a steady, thoughtful gaze, like she was taking in every ridge, every shadow, every breath of this vast land that would soon be her home. Colt wasn't used to silence that felt comfortable. But for the moment it did. Still, he cleared his throat and spoke first. "It's about a 2-hour ride," he told her, flicking the reins gently. "Hope you're not too tired after the train." She shook her head. "A long ride doesn't bother me. Resting does." He glanced sideways at her. "Most folks complain before we reach the first-mile marker." She smiled faintly, a smile that didn't ask for approval, didn't perform for anyone. "Then I'm not most folks." Colt let the horses pick up pace, the cold air slapping against his cheeks, turning them raw. Beside him, Hannah only pulled her shawl tighter, eyes still fixed on the wide horizon. The prairie opened before them, endless and unpredictable. Sagebrush rippled in the wind, and the shadows of far-off hills stretched like giant sleeping creatures. The world out here didn't care who you were. It didn't soften itself for anyone. Colt wondered if she knew that. "Where you come from," he said after a long moment. "Weather anything like this?" "No," she answered simply. But life wasn't easy there either. He studied her, not openly but from the corner of his eye. She had the look of someone who'd been pushed by life, shaped by hardship, but refused to break. The kind of strength that didn't brag, didn't announce itself. It just existed. "What was it like?" he asked quietly. Her fingers paused on the hem of her shawl. "Crowded. Loud. Everyone rushing somewhere. No one truly seeing anyone else. And you left all that for this?" He motioned to the barren expanse around them, land so empty it had its own kind of loneliness. "I didn't leave much," she murmured. "Just a room with peeling wallpaper and a job sewing dresses for women who never knew my name." Colt exhaled through his nose. He knew what it was like to be unseen. To be overlooked because you kept your head down and your scars hidden. "So," he said gently, "what made you answer a stranger's letter?" She turned her face toward him, her expression honest, unguarded. "Because your letter didn't sound like it came from a man looking for a servant, or someone to warm his bed. It sounded like it came from a man trying to rebuild a life." Colt gripped the reins tighter. "And maybe," she added softly, "I was looking to rebuild one too." Cold wind tugged at Colt's coat. For a moment he forgot the chill entirely. He swallowed hard. "Didn't think I said all that in those letters." "You didn't have to," she replied. "Lonely people write with a certain shape to their words." Her gaze drifted back to the prairie. "And I recognized it." Colt was silent. Not because he disagreed, but because he wasn't sure he'd ever been so clearly understood by anyone. The horses trotted rhythmically, their hooves thudding softly against frozen earth. Stars began to prick the sky, one then 5 then dozens, bright and cold and watching. Hannah drew in a slow breath, her voice carried by the wind. "It's quiet here." "Too quiet for some," Colt said. "Not for me." He looked at her again, this woman who stepped off a train into a life that was rough, uncertain, and unforgiving, and realized something unexpected. She wasn't afraid. Not of him. Not of the land. Not of the unknown stretched before them. Most brides sent for comfort, security, a warm home and a man to protect them. But Hannah, she had come looking for something else. A new beginning. A place where she could stand, steady and unshaken, without the noise of the world drowning her out. Colt's voice came out low. "You're not like other folks, are you?" She didn't blush, didn't look away. "I'd hate to be." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine from distant forests. Colt wrapped his fingers around the reins, guiding the horses as the path dipped into a valley. "You cold?" he asked. "A little." He removed his coat and draped it around her shoulders before she could protest. "Colt," she began. "Don't fuss," he said. "You're the one who's new to our weather." She looked down at the heavy coat around her small frame. Her voice softened. "Thank you." The words were simple, but they held weight. As they continued across the darkening land, side by side on that lonely wagon, Colt felt something shift inside him, quiet and unfamiliar. Not comfort, not ease, but the beginning of trust. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of belonging. Together, they rode on toward the ranch that carried his scars, and perhaps the place where she would heal from hers. By the time the wagon crested the final hill, the moon had risen, pale, wide and cold above the Wyoming landscape. Its soft glow spread across the valley where Colt Maddox's ranch sat, revealing long lines of fencing, rolling pastures and scattered pines bending under winter's breath. But Hannah noticed something else first. The blackened bones of a barn. Charred beams jutted from the snow like the ribs of some fallen creature. One wall stood half intact but the rest lay collapsed, timber burned through. Soot still marked the ground as if the fire had happened yesterday instead of months ago. Colt didn't say a word as they neared it. He didn't have to. His silence said enough. The wagon slowed. Hannah sat straighter, her breath catching softly as she took in the damage. She had expected remote. She had expected rugged. She hadn't expected tragedy. The cabin stood beside the ruin, solid but worn, built from thick logs, the chimney still smoking faintly from the fire Colt had started before heading into town. A lantern hung by the door, tossing a warm glow across the porch. "Home," Colt said quietly, though the words seemed to scrape his throat on the way out. Hannah studied the way he looked at his land, like it was both sanctuary and graveyard. The kind of place a man stayed not because it was easy, but because leaving would break him more than any hardship ever could. He climbed down from the wagon and offered his hand again. She took it, steadying herself as the cold nipped through her dress and boots. Her first step onto the ranch felt strangely significant, like crossing an unseen threshold. She didn't release his hand right away and he didn't rush her. Finally, she looked around with quiet understanding. "You went through something here," she said softly. Colt stiffened. Not defensive, just raw. "The storm last spring brought lightning," he replied. "Hit the barn late at night. By the time I got the horses out, roof was already gone." He hesitated, voice low. "Lost more than the building." Hannah didn't ask what more meant. She didn't need to. The way his jaw tightened, the way his eyes flicked back toward the burned ruin. She knew loss when she saw it. Loss had a way of settling in the shoulders, in the stillness of a person's breath. Instead of offering sympathy, a thing that often scraped like sandpaper, she took a few steps toward the barn remains. She knelt, gloved fingers hovering above the charred timbers. Not touching, just observing, acknowledging. "This land fought something terrible," she murmured. "But it's still standing." She rose again, brushing the snow off her gloves. "So are you." Colt turned his head sharply as if her words hit deeper than she realized. He opened his mouth, but she moved on, walking toward the cabin, taking his measure of the place with steady eyes rather than fear or judgment. "I'm guessing it's just you here," she said, examining the stacked firewood and the tools left by the door. "Has been since the fire." Pause. Had a ranch hand, but he moved on. "People leave when things fall apart," she said. "It's easier." He looked at her. "You didn't." "I chose not to." She faced him then, fully, the lamplight softening her features. "You sent for a wife, Mr. Maddox? Not a decoration. Not a dependent. A partner." Colt felt something cold and tight in him loosen only slightly. He didn't know how to explain the weight of months spent alone rebuilding fences with burned hands, sleeping with a shotgun nearby because coyotes grew bold when a man had no one to watch his back. He didn't know how to say how many nights he doubted this ranch had anything left worth salvaging. But now, standing before him, was a woman who looked at his broken land not with fear, but with a quiet willingness to stay. "You don't gotta start working on anything tonight," he told her, voice rougher than usual. "Travel must have worn you out." She shook her head gently. "Tired, yes, but not worn down." Then she did something unexpected. She moved to the wagon, set down her carpetbag and began rolling up her sleeves. Colt blinked. "What are you doing?" Looking around. She pushed the loose curls back behind her ear. "You need the right-hand side of that barn stabilized before the next storm. And the fencing near the creek looks like it's leaning." He stared at her. Longer than he meant to. Longer than was polite. "You're not afraid to get your hands dirty?" he asked. She gave a quiet, almost amused laugh. "Colt, I've had dirty hands my whole life." The wind gusted between them, sending snow dancing in swirls around their feet. Colt watched her, this small woman in a blue dress, standing in the ruins of what was once his life, and something new sparked in him. Not admiration. Not yet trust. But recognition. A woman who knew hardship. A woman who didn't crumble. A woman who stood before a broken ranch and saw not devastation, but possibility. "Come inside," he said finally, voice softer. "Warm up. I'll show you the place." Hannah nodded and followed him toward the cabin. As he opened the door to let her in, Colt paused, watching her silhouette against the snowy backdrop. She had stepped into the dark edges of his life without hesitation. And somehow he didn't know how. It felt like the ranch might breathe again. The morning sun glinted weakly through a thin layer of clouds as Colt Maddox stepped outside. Frost clung to the edges of the porch, and the wind carried a sharp bite that made his jaw ache. He strode toward the half-fallen barn, a beam of timber in hand that he had been trying to lift alone for weeks. It barely budged. Colt grunted, muscles straining. Every time he thought he had it, the beam would slip back to the snow. His hands were raw from the work, his patience fraying faster than the ropes he'd used to stabilize the structure. Then he felt it, a movement beside him. Hannah Rose Whitfield had stepped out quietly from the cabin. She adjusted her shawl, took a deep breath, and walked to the other end of the beam. "Let me take the other side," she said calmly. Colt froze. "Hannah, you don't have to." "I want to," she interrupted, her eyes steady and fearless. "We're in this together, remember?" He swallowed hard. That calm confidence, that fearless determination, took him completely by surprise. He'd imagined her as delicate, hesitant, the kind of woman who would stay out of the way while he handled the heavy labor. She wasn't like that at all. Together they lifted the beam. Not perfectly, not without effort, but it moved, slowly, steadily, into place. Colt staggered back, chest heaving. His hands tingled from exertion, but it wasn't the work that had his heart racing. It was her, this small, determined woman who had proven herself stronger than he'd expected. He breathed out, a mix of awe and disbelief. "Hannah, you never told me you were this strong." She blushed faintly, snow melting from her curls. "I didn't think you'd need to know." Colt shook his head, a crooked grin tugging at his lips. "A woman doesn't usually move timber like that." "I'm not most women," she said softly. Her eyes sparkled, not with mischief, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had faced hardship before and survived. He leaned against the barn post, still catching his breath. "You're something else, Hannah. I wasn't ready for that." Her laugh was soft, warm against the cold morning air. "I hope that's good." Colt nodded slowly. "It's better than good. It's unexpected." She smiled, brushing snow from her sleeve. And in that moment, as the prairie stretched endlessly around them, Colt realized something he hadn't expected. He didn't want her to be delicate. He wanted her exactly as she was, strong, fearless, and unafraid to stand beside him. Together, they carried the beam into the barn and began the slow, steady work of rebuilding not just the structure, but the beginnings of a life they would share. And for the first time, Colt felt the weight of loneliness lifting, replaced by something warmer, something alive. The wind arrived suddenly, whipping across the ranch like a living thing, shaking the cabin walls and bending the young pines near the creek. Clouds swallowed the sun, turning the day to dim gray, and snow began to swirl in frantic eddies around the burned barn and the half-rebuilt fences. Hannah Rose Whitfield stood at the cabin doorway, her shawl clutched tightly against her chest, watching the storm roll in. She could hear it coming long before it arrived, the low, rolling roar of wind across open plains, the faint warning snap of distant branches breaking. The storm had teeth and it didn't hold back. Colt Maddox appeared beside her, his broad frame cutting a shadow against the cabin's warm glow. His coat flapped in the wind, and his eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon. "You'll get wet if you stand out here," he said. His voice carried easily over the rising wind. "I don't mind," Hannah said. She turned her face up to the snowflakes, letting them melt into her curls. "I've weathered worse storms before." Colt blinked at her, caught by the mixture of strength and grace she displayed, standing steady in the face of a gale that could topple fences and tear shingles from roofs. He had imagined his bride as delicate, quiet, perhaps frightened of the prairie's relentless moods. But Hannah, she faced it without flinching. "You're not afraid of this storm?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Not afraid of the weather, or the land, or you, Mr. Maddox?" Colt's lips twitched, almost a smile, almost a laugh. He reached for the door, tugging her gently inside, but she resisted for a moment, letting the wind play with her hair. "You could have stayed in the cabin," he said, voice roughened by admiration. "Why stand out here?" "Because storms show a person what they're made of," Hannah replied, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "And if I'm going to live out here on this land, I want to know I can stand." Colt was struck silent, not because her words were brave, they were, but because they were true. She hadn't come to rely on him. She had come to be with him, to face the wildness of this land side by side. The wind rattled the cabin shutters, and the fire inside cast flickering shadows across the room. Colt moved closer, brushing snow from her shoulders with the back of his hand, careful, deliberate. "Storms pass," he murmured. "But a strong woman like you?" His voice faltered slightly. "She doesn't need waiting out." Hannah looked at him, her blue eyes wide beneath the lantern light. "I didn't come to be sheltered, Colt. I came to build a life. With you." He swallowed, heart hammering in a way he hadn't felt in years. The wind howled again, rattling the cabin door, but all he could hear was her voice, steady, calm, fearless. "Colt," she whispered, "you don't have to carry the weight of this place alone." He exhaled slowly, leaning against the doorframe. "Ain't used to someone saying that to me." Her hand brushed lightly against his, almost accidental, almost shy, but deliberate enough to make him flinch. Warmth ran from her fingers up his arm, stronger than any fire, steadier than the lantern light flickering between them. "I want to help," she said softly. "To be here, to be yours, if you'll let me." Colt's eyes met hers, a slow, dawning realization in his chest. She wasn't fragile. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't here to watch or wait. She was here to fight, to build, to stand beside him. And for the first time in years he felt the ache in his chest ease. Loneliness had held him tight for too long, but now he was breathing it out, letting someone in, letting hope Indiana. "You're staying," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then louder, steady, sure, "and I'm not letting you face this land, or life, alone." Hannah smiled, faint and soft, but in it was the promise of storms weathered together, of long days and hard work shared, of a life slowly mending broken things. The wind shrieked around the cabin, snow rattled against the roof, but inside, by the firelight and in each other's presence, there was warmth. For the first time the storm outside didn't matter. It had nothing on the storm inside, the one that had begun quietly months ago in letters, and was now blazing between them, steady, alive, and undeniable. The storm had passed, leaving a brittle silence in its wake. Snow clung to every branch and fence post, sparkling like scattered glass in the morning sun. The ranch lay quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed into a person's chest and made the world feel impossibly still. Hannah Rose Whitfield sat at the cabin window, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Outside, the frost glittered, and the soft creak of the wind through the pines reminded her that the land was alive, even in its frozen stillness. Colt Maddox leaned against the doorframe, his silhouette dark against the pale light. He had been watching her for a long while, quiet, not because he didn't know what to say, but because sometimes words weren't enough. Finally, Hannah set the mug down, her fingers lingering on the warm ceramic. She turned to him, eyes steady, but her voice carried a weight she hadn't yet shared. "Colt," she began softly, "there's something I should tell you. Something I never told anyone." He stepped closer, curious, cautious. "You can tell me anything, Hannah. Ain't got a reason to turn away." She took a deep breath, as if drawing courage from the warm cabin air. "Before I left my old town, before I answered your letter, I was engaged once. To a man I thought I loved." Her eyes flickered down to the floor, hands tightening. "But he left. Said I was too weak, too fragile for the life he wanted. He didn't see me, not really. Said I wouldn't survive hardships, and then he walked away." Colt's jaw tightened. Anger flared briefly in his chest, not at her but at the man who had done this to her. "He was a fool," Colt said quietly, voice rough and low. "A damn fool." Hannah shook her head. "Maybe. But it taught me a lot. I learned to fight, to stand on my own, to survive, no matter what. That's why I answered your letter. Because I didn't want to be anyone's shadow. I wanted to be someone who could face the land, the hardships, and even a man like you, and stand." Colt stepped closer, his heavy boots crunching softly on the wooden floor. The air between them seemed to hum, charged with unsaid words, with the weight of trust forming in fragile strands. "I didn't think I deserved a woman like you," he said, his voice breaking slightly, as if confessing a truth he'd buried under years of solitude. "A woman who's strong, brave, and don't need protecting all the time. You've shown me more than anyone ever has. And he stopped, swallowing hard. "I ain't good at saying this, but I don't want to lose you. Not now. Not ever." Hannah lifted her eyes, meeting his. For the first time, vulnerability mirrored vulnerability. She stepped closer, hands trembling just enough to betray the fear that had sat quietly beneath her courage. "Colt, I chose to come here. To you. Not because I need saving, but because I saw something in you, something worth staying for. And I want to build that, if you'll let me." He took a step forward, closing the distance until their shoulders nearly touched. The warmth of his presence made her heart thrum against her ribs, steady and wild all at once. "You already are building it, Hannah?" he murmured, voice low and rough. "And I'm not letting you leave. Not like anyone else ever left me." The sun broke fully through the clouds, spilling light across the frost outside, turning the snow to diamonds. Inside, the cabin seemed to glow in quiet warmth, the kind that only comes from shared truths and hard-won trust. Hannah reached out, letting her hand brush against Colt's. He caught it gently, fingers intertwining with hers, holding on, not possessively, not with demand but with reverence. "Then let's do it," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "Let's build it, together." Colt nodded, a slow, steady gesture that carried more than words ever could. "Together," he agreed, and for the first time in years he felt the loneliness ease completely, replaced by something fierce and alive. A bond forged in truth, courage, and a shared willingness to face whatever the land, the storms, or life itself could throw at them. Outside, the wind rustled the pines. Inside, a quiet warmth settled between them. Two hearts, scarred by life, now standing side by side, ready to face the long road ahead, together. Winter was fading. The snow had melted from the fences, the creek ran clear again, and the air carried the sweet, crisp scent of early spring. Willow Creek looked different now, softened by sun and thaw, but the ranch looked stronger than ever, a testament not just to labor but to hope. Hannah Rose Whitfield stood near the fence line, hands resting on the rough wood, eyes scanning the horizon. The barn, once blackened and broken, now rose proudly with new beams, a sturdy roof and windows catching the sunlight. She ran her fingers along the railing, feeling the warmth of the sun on the wood, and thought of how far they had come. Not just the ranch but the life she and Colt had begun to build together. Colt Maddox rode up slowly, his horse kicking up soft clouds of dust along the path. He dismounted and approached, coat dusted with early pollen, a broad smile tugging at the corners of his lips. There was still a quiet edge to him, still a roughness honed by years alone on this land, but today it softened. "Morning, Hannah," he said, his voice low but filled with warmth. "Morning, Colt," she replied, turning to him, a smile brightening her face. He stepped closer, boots crunching against the thawing earth, and held out his hand. She took it instinctively, and the touch carried everything words could never say: safety, trust, affection, the steady beat of hearts learning to beat together. "You ready for a proper breakfast?" he asked, a teasing note in his voice, though his eyes softened as he watched her. She laughed, light and musical, and shook her head. "You've worked me harder than I expected, Mr. Maddox. I think I've earned it." Colt chuckled, the sound deep and easy, the first laugh he had shared freely in months. "Earned it, huh? That's the truth of it. You've done more than I ever imagined anyone could." They walked together toward the cabin, boots crunching through soft grass and scattered patches of lingering frost. The warmth from the cabin greeted them, and the smell of fresh bread and coffee mingled in the air. Inside, the hearth glowed, and Hannah's small touches, neat linens, a few flowers picked from the thawed earth, made the cabin feel like a home. Colt watched her as she moved about, effortlessly making the space hers without losing a shred of the life they had both fought to rebuild. The thought struck him hard: she hadn't just joined his life, she had made it better, brighter, stronger. He stepped behind her, resting a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Hannah," he said softly, I never believed I'd find someone who'd see me, not just the ranch, not just the man I tried to be, but the whole damn mess I am, and still decide to stay." Hannah leaned back slightly into his hand, letting the warmth of him settle around her. "I didn't come to fix anything," she whispered. "I came to stand beside you. That's all I ever wanted." Colt lowered his hat from where it had shadowed his eyes, letting the sun catch his face. He reached for her hand, gripping it gently, and for a long moment they just stood there, two people who had weathered storms, heartbreak, and loneliness, finally finding something rare and steady in each other. "You're mine, Hannah," he said, voice low, earnest. "Not because you have to be. Not because I need someone to fill a space, but because I can't imagine facing this life, these hills, these storms, these winters, without you." She smiled, tears prickling the corners of her eyes, and squeezed his hand. "And you're mine, Colt. Not because I need protection. Not because I need comfort. But because I choose you. Every day I choose you." A soft wind drifted through the cabin open door, carrying the scent of new grass, earth thawing, and the promise of spring. Outside, the prairie stretched wide, golden and alive, welcoming the life they would build together. Colt pulled her into a slow embrace, holding her against him, and for the first time, he let himself fully believe in a future that wasn't shadowed by loss or solitude. Hannah rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart, the kind of rhythm that promised consistency, strength, and unwavering care. They stayed that way for a long moment, letting the warmth of each other fill the gaps that life had left empty for so long. The ranch was rebuilt, the land healed, and now so were they. And when they finally pulled apart, smiles still lingering, Colt reached for the reins of the horse outside. "Ready for a ride?" he asked. "Always," Hannah replied, eyes sparkling with excitement and trust. Together they walked to the horse, hands brushing as they moved. The prairie stretched before them, wide, untamed, and alive, just like the life they had chosen to face together. And as they rode across the open plains, sun warming their backs and wind tugging at their clothes, they knew that no storm, no fire, no loss could ever take this from them. Because they had each other. And that was everything.